Good evening, viewers, and welcome to another edition of My Take with yours truly. Now, let's get right into tonight's discussion. As you know, the purpose of this program, why I started this program, is to give you my take and my perspective on a lot of issues in the public domain of national importance, and especially in light of the fact that there is an overwhelming amount of misinformation within the public domain. Misinformation, disinformation, false information, whatever you want to call it. So, my objective is to deal with these issues to you and bring a different perspective from a factual standpoint and an evidence-based standpoint. So, what has been dominating the, say, 90% of the newspapers and the public discourses is oil and gas. We will probably be debating oil and gas for the next, for the next 100 years. So quickly, there are a few top issues that I want to touch on that has been propagated, and I'm not going to be kind tonight. I think I'm very reserved. I try to be reserved on many of these programs, but tonight I'm going to relax a bit and not be so reserved. So I'm referring specifically to a number of reports coming out of Kaicho News on issues in the oil and gas space. So let's take them one at a time that has been dominating the newspaper pages this week. The first one is they've been publishing these reports, these analysis by some guy by the name of Tom Sanzillo, who is associated with an international organization that is a think tank. But that international organization, and I've written several pieces of articles exposing this organization, who they are, what is their mission, and who funds them. And who funds these organizations are really global and renewable energy advocacy groups and renewable energy companies globally fund these organizations, and their mission are one that in which they drive an aggressive campaign against oil producing companies, and especially ExxonMobil. So I saw, he's been writing, and I've debated this guy several times in the past over the last 2 years, and I haven't seen any report from him in a long time, for about a year now. And now he suddenly re-emerge in the local media, of course, at the request of the publisher of Kaicho News. And he specifically was asked to comment on the recent High Court ruling. And he's arguing that how one of his first reports this week, he argued that the $2 billion parent company guarantee is inadequate when you look at the total value of ExxonMobil, the global parent company, which is 429 odd billion US dollars. But that is a distorted perspective. That is an egregiously, deliberately calculated, distorted perspective, because you got to understand the proper context, right? So let me explain in the simplest way that I can what is happening with the insurance coverage, because the last program I went into in a very academic way, deconstructed the High Court's ruling respectfully. You would recall that we have examined the judge's ruling verbatim, excerpts from the judge's ruling, and then we would have juxtaposed that with the environmental permit, the terms and conditions in the environmental permit, and then we would have examined what are the facts. What do we have? So what we have is, we've argued, and the argument by ExxonMobil and EPA and myself, who is I'm a finance professional, there is no such thing as an unlimited guarantee, and I would have dealt with that extensively in the last program. What you have is a parent company guarantee, and the parent company guarantee is an added layer of coverage. The Environmental Act requires the companies, the contractor, to provide additional financial assurance. So basically, what is intended is that the companies involved, in this case the oil companies, that they have the financial capability to deal with any environmental liability that may occur in a worst case scenario. Now, we could argue from now until Neverwary on all the millions and billions and trillions of scenarios that we can think of, and we could simulate, and we could argue. But there has to be a methodology, as I would have demonstrated in the last program, and those of you who follow me, who follow my writings, I would have also written extensively. So the latest audited financial statements of the local subsidiaries, namely EEPGL, Hess, and CNOC, are now within the public domain. These financial statements would have been submitted as part of the court documents vis-a-vis the recent ruling. So that document is now in the public domain, right? So what you want to know is, do we have sufficient financial coverage in the event of a spill, right? What is the coverage that we have now? Having now had the opportunity to look at those recent numbers, the total consolidated assets of the local subsidiaries stood at, as of December 2022, $19 billion US. That is greater than this country's GDP, which is only $14 billion. So $19 billion US dollars. Then there is the insurance coverage, which is about $600 million US dollars. That's another additional layer of coverage. Then you have the parent company guarantee of $2 billion. So you have a total coverage as of now of about $21.6 billion US dollars. That is more than the value of this entire economy, more than all the money we have in the bank. So if there is a spill, and if the cost exceeds $21 billion, the parent company is still liable. But you can't discount the fact that Exxon is producing all the time. We're going to add a third platform this year, which will take up production from 350,000 barrels per day to about 560,000 barrels per day. The revenue, the cash flow generated from the operations here will increase substantially, which means your total assets will increase substantially as well over time as we increase production. So it is not stagnant at $21 billion. The local assets, the cash flow generated, the total assets, and so here is increasing as production levels increase. And more importantly to note is that obviously as the level of production increase, now for example, currently we're producing from 2 FPSOs. And so we have obtained a parent company guarantee of $2 billion US dollars. That is in addition to the total assets of the local subsidiaries and insurance. So as the number of FPSOs increase, where, for example, by 2030, we anticipate to have 10 FPSOs. Now, obviously, as you have greater level of production, a greater number of FPSOs, it means that the environmental risk would increase. But as that environmental risk increase, you have the revenue that we will generate, the premium for that risk will also increase substantially, and the insurance coverage that we have now is not set in stone. The insurance coverage that we have now will have to be revised upwards, and the parent company guarantee will also have to be revised upwards. The estimates would have to be revised. So the $2 billion in the insurance and the total assets as of now, it's not stagnant. It's going to increase, revised upwards as we increase production. I can't put it simpler than that. And you can't look at, oh, it's a $2 billion guarantee, which is chicken feed money according to Tom Sanzillo, relative to the whole company's worth $429 billion. Well, the truth is, or the fact is, Exxon parent company has operations all over this world, and they have to cover their operations in the same manner they have to cover their risk exposure in Guyana. They have to cover their risk exposure in the US, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, all over. So the guarantee is not relative to the sum of the parent company guarantee is not relative to the size of the total company. It's relative to the size of the operations in the market. And that is commonsensical. You don't have to be a genius to know that. Anyways, that's the first thing. That's the first thing that I dealt with, and I've dealt with it vis-a-vis a letter to the press earlier this week. The second thing, again, on the same guy, Tom Sanzillo. Now he's what they say. There is a term that is used often, fear-mongering, if that's the correct term. And he came up with what I call a magical number, and it's in today's paper. It's in yesterday's Kaicho News. That if we have a spill, and he's assuming that we can have a spill like in the BP explosion, there is no risk mitigation mechanism. He didn't consider the fact that we got a capping stack. I explained this to you in the last program. He didn't consider all of that, and he did not consider the fact that Exxon's own history, they do not have a history of a massive well blowout as in the one by BP in the Gulf of Mexico. And he has not considered the fact that, the safety procedures, the safety standard operating procedures, the technology in the industry and safety standards are the highest globally and the most highly regulated globally. Anyways, and Exxon is on top of that. Exxon is one of the leader in that regard in terms of those aspect of its enterprise management framework. Now, so he came up with this number that the economic activity it will cost over $140 billion. And Kaichor quoted him as saying that the marine sector, he's referring to a few neighboring countries, namely Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and I don't know which other countries he considered, but he said a few and he named Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados. That the marine sector and the tourism sector alone, those countries, it generate over $140 billion US. Now, listen, I deal with numbers on a daily basis, and as a financial analyst, you use numbers to tell stories, and you got to be able to interpret numbers, what numbers mean. So obviously, if a number is not right, you would recognize it immediately. And immediately when I read the headline, I recognized that this number can't be right. Why? Because if he is saying only two sectors for a few countries in our Caribbean neighbors will stand to lose, um, or are risking over 140 billion US. That cannot be correct when, in fact, the entire GDP, not just a few sectors, but the entire GDP for the whole of CARICOM as of 2022 is an estimated 100 billion US dollars. The entire GDP for CARICOM, right? The tourism sector and the marine sector contributes less than 20% to the overall GDP. Less than 20%, about 17.5 billion US dollars. So where did he get $140 billion from? And he hasn't justified it. He hasn't explained how he calculated it. He's just calling numbers. I have demonstrated, as I've just did. I just explained to you how I arrive at my number, and you can go and verify this. These are verifiable facts. You can go on the internet. You can look at the IDB. IDB publishes an annual report on the entire region, and it talks about economic performance and GDP. You could now go and individually add up all the GDP for all these countries, and you'll get about $100 billion. And then you could go individually and you could see to what extent, or the report would tell you what percentage of the tourism sector contributes to the overall GDP. So I'm giving you this source, credible source, of how you can go and verify this information for yourself. You don't have to be a financial analyst, right? But he can't tell us how he arrived at 140 billion. It's total nonsense, absolute nonsense. Trinidad and Tobago producing oil for 100 years. Venezuela producing oil for however long. Venezuela is our next door neighbor. Where were all these people? Suriname also producing oil. Well, now they're exploring offshore, but they've been producing oil onshore for a long time. Where were all these people? Where were all these people about the risk of an oil spill and all these things? Right? Trinidad and Tobago has had several oil spills, but they were contained. The environmental impact was contained, was minimized. It didn't affect us, it didn't affect your neighbors. So what happened to Guyana? As we would say in local dialect, what happened to Guyana? Goat bite us? Anyways, moving on from Tom Sanzillo. Let me see what else I need to deal with tonight. Now, let's now move to some, I don't know how to describe this, but you the viewers, you make your own analysis. So, a few days ago, one of Kaicho News headline articles, Exxon, the oil companies, from 2019 to 2022, the oil companies has made 3 times more profit than Guyana. Big headline, huge headline. Let me see if I could find it. Let me see if I can find it quickly. Yes. Exxon and partners profits from 2020 to 2022 3 times more than Guyana's oil revenues. Now, and there is a table in the article. I should have asked the operator to pull this up, but that's okay. I'll read it for you. So they show the table in the article. In 2020, the oil companies got 5.6 billion. 2021, 255 billion. 2022, 1.2 trillion, giving rise to a total of 1.49 trillion. And they looked at Guyana's oil money for the period, and we have gotten $421 billion. Now, what they ought to have done is the journalist of Kaicho News and the publisher of Kaicho News is not a finance professional or a financial analyst to understand how to interpret and how to analyze the financial statements. And I'll explain it to you in a minute. But before I explain and seek to simplify the technicalities, I saw the Vice President alluded to it briefly in his last press conference, but I'll get into a little bit more details. But before I get to that level, and you answer this, you the viewers answer this question honestly. If you have a deal, you have an agreement, you have a contract, and the contract says that you're getting 2% royalty plus a 50-50 profit share, a 50-50 split. So it means if we make $1 in profit, you get 50%, I get 50%. You get 50 cents, I get 50 cents. So if it is a 50-50 split, then how on earth, you tell me, how on earth could I get 3 times more than you? And all the numbers are published, audited, there is no skullduggery or no fraud or anything. No skullduggery, no fraud. How could I get 3 times more than you if it is a 50-50? Common sense, right? The fact is, and the financial statements are, as I said earlier, is now within the public domain. Anybody, you don't have to take my word for it. And you don't have to be a financial analyst. I can explain to you how you could do it yourself. It's all you need to know is how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. That is all. Right? The financial statements can be obtained from anybody. Could go to the deeds registry. I think you pay $2,000 or $3,000. You go back in a few days and you could get copies of EEPGL, HES, and CNOC financial statements. Or you could call Kaicho News or any one of the media house because they have it. The media houses have the financial statements. Okay? Now, financial statements have to be prepared in accordance with, in Guyana's case, what is called the IFRS standards, International Financial Reporting Standards. So, statements have to be prepared in accordance to that rule, which means the gross earnings, rather the earnings that Kaicho News is relying on here, in which they're showing the Guyanese public that oil companies have made more money, 3 times more profit than us. It's incorrect, and it's totally incorrect because they have used the gross earnings. That $1.49 trillion includes Guyana's share of profit. So you now have when you get the financial statements, you now have to apply the fiscal formula. What is the fiscal formula? I'll break it down for you. The fiscal formula is the fiscal rules, which is in, and we know so well, thanks to Kaicho News publisher, he repeats it every day, is the 2% royalty, the 50% profit share, and then you have the 75% cost recovery. Now, 75% of the revenue is not the total operating cost. That is just the ceiling in which Exxon could use to recover their investment costs, invested capital, as well as to deploy in future projects, so that you have the remainder to share at the onset, where Exxon could get some profit at during these period, as well as the government of Guyana. That is why the formula is structured in that manner, right? So when you apply 75% of the gross revenues and you less that and you calculate 50% of the profit, 50% for the government, 50% for the oil companies, then you calculate 2% royalty on the total production, right? That is what you now have to do when you have the financial statements around you to determine how much Guyana get and how much Exxon get. And in a matter of days, I've actually just completed preparing a very thorough analysis, looking at, for example, the cumulative cash flows, the cumulative net cash flows from since 2019 to 2022, using the financial statements to really understand. And the analysis dispelled a lot of falsehood and misrepresentation of information that this particular media house has been propagating and is propagating on a daily basis. So, for example, I explained the profit share, how you have to calculate it to determine, and that is incorrect. In today's article, it says the government, oil companies are united in keeping cost recovery numbers hidden. Now that's a total lie. The cost recovery numbers cannot be hidden when they have the financial reports. All they have to do is go on, which I did, look at the statement of cash flows, or you look at the financial statements. There is the income statement, there is the statement of financial position, there is the statement of cash flows. And you look at the net cash flows. Net cash flows from operating activities. Operating activities means the daily expenditure to keep the business going, procure goods and services, pay wages and salaries and so forth, pay bills, right? And that's a huge bill. Those expenditure are huge. And of course, the revenue generated as part of your net operating cash flows. How you derive your net operating cash flows, your operating expense minus your operating revenue. Then you have cash flows, net cash flows from investing activities, and you have net cash flows for financing activities. Now, I'm not going to bore you with technicalities. I'm going to put it in the simplest form to answer the question. The question is the recovery numbers hidden? And there is a view that, okay, the oil companies getting a ton of profit. For example, in 2022, the oil companies made $56 billion US dollars in profit. Guyanese jump up, Kaito News jump up, look how much money they made, more money than God, and a whole bunch of nonsense. But if you look at EEPGL's net profit for 2022 and look at their profit for the entire 2019, 2020, 2022, it's less than 1% of the total earnings. The net earnings in 2022 for EEPGL, which is the local subsidiary, contributed less than 1% of the net earnings of $56 billion. So what that means, it means that the money that they make here is not even 1% of the $56 billion. So what are people getting? What is the big hullabaloo about? You got to do proper analysis, and if you can't just propagate misinformation, they have a ton of economists and financial professionals in this country. Christopher Ram, Yog, so many of them. And this is the type of stuff Tom Sanzilo and all these foreign experts should be doing. Not to distort it, but of course they have an agenda. They're not interested in that. You're not interested in anybody who's doing a proper and a thorough analysis and presenting the correct context, right? And then all of the cash flows, the money that they have used to recover, they've invested about $12 billion, 12 billion US dollars. In Liza 1, for example, was about 4 billion US dollars. Then there is Liza 2, and then they're deploying more capital to develop future projects to keep that momentum. So when you look at the statement of cash flows, what you will find is that Exxon, the oil companies, ExxonMobil and its co-ventures, they redeploy 99% of the cash flows, in which means the profit included, the profit they make here back into Guyana to one, recover their initial investment. Having recovered that, they redeploy it back, just like if you have a business. If you're running a small shop or whatever business you have, you put in your capital, you purchase your goods, you sold that first set of goods, you made back your money plus the profit. Instead of you taking the profit and eating it out and taking the initial capital and don't worry about building the business and growing the business, you've reinvested all that money, all that profit to keep growing, buying more goods, buying more whatever is the commodity you're selling to keep grow your business. And by doing so, you over the long term, you're creating greater profit, bigger profits, and you grow the business in a sustainable manner. That is exactly what the oil companies are doing based on the analysis that I've done, based on the numbers. 99% of it. So it means the money that the profit that they generate here, it is not used to pay dividend to the shareholders. It is used to redeploy here in Guyana to reinvest and develop future projects. Which who's the primary beneficiary? It is Guyana. Well, the oil contractors are going to benefit in the long term, but we are the immediate beneficiary, because whereas their shareholders, who are the investors, are getting zero dividend from us, we have gotten 21% of their net cash flows, cumulative net cash flows in profit and royalty, and they've only repaid their parent company 0.3%, which would be utilized back again. And this is the context that is missing. This is the fact. And you don't have to take this from me. You go, and if you sit down with your accountant, there's so many. Anybody who understands the basics, run it, put the numbers in an Excel sheet and do the calculation, you'll see. That is the fact. Anyways, enough of that now. Enough of the financial aspect. I think I've dealt sufficiently with those issues and dispelling them, which is verifiable. Now, the other thing I want to talk about tonight. Most of you might have saw that the publisher would have had an interview with a very well-regarded, well-established professor out of Africa, African professor, Professor Lumumba, on Saturday. Now, I want to comment on that interview for the remainder of this program. And before I do so, it is important that I articulate a background as to why I want to do that. And the reason why I want to do that is because we've already established, and it is as clear as day, that the publisher of Kaichua News has an agenda, a political one. He's going all over the place, hosting rallies and so on. That's fine. That's fine. Nothing is wrong with that. The problem, or the danger in his methodology, which is bad for the country, is he is doing it at the expense of misleading an entire nation. At the expense of misleading an entire nation. And let me be fair. Let me be fair. Maybe not everything he misrepresents. Maybe some of the things that he represents and champions, I have no doubt that he's a good human being. Maybe there's some merit in some of them and some issues that we need to, as a country, we need to really examine and deal with. But let me acknowledge that before I do this. Coming back now to the misinformation is specifically in the oil and gas space. Now let's come to the interview. It is my view that with that background in mind, the purpose of his interview with this renowned professor was to, and because the posture of this professor, he is well known as an outspoken professor in the entire African continent, and he's well known throughout the globe for his anti-corruption stance and his anti-West, anti-colonialism, imperialism stance. He's a staunch advocate in that regard. And so, of course, he wanted to feel, I'm going to, and I will demonstrate for you in a moment. He wanted validation, or he was seeking validation in where there's perhaps, some of the things he said resonates. And I had predicted when I looked at the interview that he was going to take that interview and the comments by the professor and now paint Guyana situation with it. So it is that which I want to deal with. Because you can go on his page and look for the interview and you'll see for yourself. You will see that the questions posed to the professor and the answers that he was looking for, the professor actually kept his answers very scholarly, very generic. Because obviously, as a scholar of his caliber, he knows that the questions framed by the publisher, by this individual, are his opinion. There is no verifiable facts, there is no evidence, and he didn't do any thorough evaluation on Guyana's situation to really speak to those questions in a factual manner. So he batted safely, and I commend him for that. That is how a true scholar would do it. But I want to show you, and I'm going to quote verbatim, and you could verify this and see whether I misquoted him and go and look at the interview for yourself. I want to use a few examples, quote him verbatim, and show where he, in his response, based on his response, the government is doing the right thing, which the publisher, who was the host of the interview, fails to acknowledge and would never acknowledge. So let's look at it. Let's look at some of the questions. I'm going to select it because it was I'm being selective in the interest of time, because the interview, I would have loved to go through the entire interview, but it would be too time consuming. It was an hour and a half long interview, but it is really interesting for you to look at for yourself. So one of the questions posed was this. So the publisher hosted the interview, and he was supported by one of his senior journalists. And the journalist posed this question, and I read it for you because I transcribed the interview verbatim to do this program specifically. The question was this: we are seeing across the world the rise of loans from China and the USA. How do we break this cycle of begging? Now, what's a key word that resonates there with you? Begging. The publisher, every day when he does his program, we borrowing all this money, we begging, and we got so much oil resources, and so on. The professor's response, he said that if I understand you well, the world is no longer uniform. The world, you remember that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States of America became the hegemon, and all the European countries then became America's lapdog. Then suddenly China has emerged, and China is emerging in a very certain way. And he went on along that line where he had a very anti-American posture. And what he, paraphrasing his answer, he said that you really can't break this cycle. There is no, the cycle that she was referring to, oh, we borrowing money. But he tied the question to me, no, we depending on one particular powerful country in the world. And what he said is that we now have, the world is changing, the global dynamics of the world is changing. So you may no longer in time to come have one dominant powerful country. There are groups of powerful countries forming themselves together, like the G7, for example. And in each continent and sub-region, you have unions, for example, like in our case, we have CARICOM, you have the European Union, and so on. You have a trading bloc, so to speak, for example. Now, what are we doing as a country? We are not relying on one country to borrow. We are deepening our relations, our diplomatic relations with China, well, India, the US, the UK, all of them we're deepening our relations. You've seen the US banks, Exim Bank, have made loans available to us. The Islamic development banks have made loan available to us. So we are not only dependent on the traditional IDB and the World Bank, which is what he was referring to. He answered the question in that context. We now have beyond that scope, beyond the IDB, beyond World Bank. So based on his answer, we as a country, we're doing the right thing. Let's look at another question. So this is the question now. This is another question posed by the publisher himself, and I'm reading verbatim. What should the citizens do to ensure that they get better deals from the development of their natural resources? And how can they hold their leaders? Yes, these leaders are accountable for good governance. You're an expert in that. And the professor's immediate response was beautiful. And of course, I'm sure this did not sit well with the publisher. He said, there is no one size fits all. So I cannot have a prescription that is uniform and universal. But there is one ingredient that I think is necessary in all these that met the demands of their leaders consistently and firmly. And his response was pretty much long-winded, but I'm going to paraphrase it. I've given you the opening statement, and I'll paraphrase the rest of his response to that question. What should the citizens do to ensure they get better deals? So first of all, he's framing the question as though our current crop of leaders are not governing in the best interest of the country. But that is not true. If you go through the interview, you would hear the professor saying how difficult it is in reality to deal with these multinational companies like ExxonMobil and the BPs and the Shells. But the truth is, you have two types of government. You have weak government and you have strong governments. The former government was a weak government, and so they were exploited. The present government is not a weak government. The present government is a strong government. But what is a strong government? A strong government doesn't mean you're flexing your muscles and you're bullying people and you're making all these, all these demands in an arrogant way. A strong government really means a shrewd government, a smart government, a competent government. And what the professor said in his response is that in order to get better deals, he made specific reference to local content, for example. Kaichou news publisher made no mention of local content and what a country is doing for local content. So what is the context? Of course, the professor does not have the benefit of the context. This is just this publisher here who we're referring to, Glenn Lyle's opinion. But the context and the fact of the matter is that while we have criticized, yes, we would agree that the current PSA deal is not the best deal. It could have been better. But there are ramifications, and I've dealt with the ramifications many times, not just on the basis of sanctity of contract. Not just on the basis of sanctity of contract, but on the basis of, because this is a global industry, the fact that that contract was such a, not compared to other fiscal regimes in other parts, in other oil producing nations, historically, it changed the competitive landscape globally. And that is facts. Because the fact that Guyana, and you would recall that Exxon started to produce before this government got into office. So you can't break an active contract. You got to wait for it to expire. You can't come in the middle where billions of dollars in investments have been committed based on those terms. Right? And I've talked about that many times and written about it, but one of the points that I've never really dealt with is the fact that it has changed. It has had a huge impact on the competitive landscape globally, meaning that because we now have this so very attractive fiscal term, and as you read the news, you go right now and Google the news, you would see Exxon Mobil and some other oil company that looking to consolidate in Guyana and targeting Guyana. They're liquidating assets in other parts of the world. They're liquidating assets to consolidate and to deploy more of their resources in Guyana because we are more competitive. So that means all the other countries previously that are also competing for investments, for investment dollars, they now have started to liberalize their fiscal terms and introduce fiscal incentives, greater incentives to make it more attractive now to compete with us. So when you have an active contract, an active agreement that has substantially changed the dynamics of the global competitive landscape, you can't go back to that, right? Because you have other countries now doing that to compete for investment dollars. And what do? We want to attract as much as possible to maintain that momentum in the long term for our country and our people. So Glenn Lyle wouldn't acknowledge that and never understand that and never explain that. But what have we done to maximize the value for the country? What we have done, the government has done, is to implement within 1 year the local content legislation. As a result of that, the country is now benefiting from close to 700 million, which is projected to reach 1 billion. That's over 200 billion Guyana dollars in local content spend in the procurement of goods and services, as well as employment of our local workforce, our Guyanese people. That is, and the professor made reference to that. Glenn Lyle ignored that. He played like he didn't hear that part. Then the gas to shore project. Anyways, let me not mention it, but the gas to shore project is also another major achievement in that regard to maximize the value for the country. Imagine what having electricity rates would translate to in terms of disposable income and the competitiveness of the business landscape for the manufacturing sector. Imagine what the savings of our fuel import bill, which stands at about 800 million US, would translate to for the country. These are huge benefits, which based on some calculations I had done, it's worth about $2 billion, $2 billion US annually to the country as a result of this. This is exactly what the professor said. And Glenn pretend as though the government is doing this. But these are the facts. These are the facts. And that is why the professor's response was so scholarly, safe, and beautiful. And I liked it, and which is why I wanted to do this so badly. Then, before I go on here, let me mention this quickly. He loved to make reference. Today I particularly for the purpose of this program, I called a former minister, a former energy minister in Trinidad and Tobago, to learn, to verify what really happened in Trinidad and Tobago. Because Kian's publisher, Glenn Lal, is repeating, and he's at the point now of prostituting this tape with the Trinidad Prime Minister, where the Prime Minister Rowley said, oh, that contracts are not written in stone, and that when circumstances change, that you could come back to the table and renegotiate. But he did not present the context in which the Prime Minister was speaking. And what I verified today, what I confirmed today, is that Prime Minister Rowley did two things. The first was a mistake where he made a mistake. He increased the royalty rate. And when he increased the royalty rate in Trinidad and Tobago, the industry the industry crashed. It no longer attracted investments. So that is one of the reasons why Trinidad is where it is today. And then specifically with renegotiation of contracts, what I confirmed today is that Prime Minister Rowley never renegotiated any active contract. What he did, he waited for some active or live contracts to expire and then renegotiated a new contract. That is what he did, which is precisely what our government and the position of our government is. That they are not going to interfere with the production chain, the current contract for the Stabroek block. But all the 9 other blocks with exploration license, which Exxon is part of some of them as well, those, when they come for production license, they will have the new fiscal terms, and when the production chain agreement is expired for the Stabroek block, and it is unlikely, based on my own estimation, that Exxon in this current life of this contract will ever be able to exhaust all of the proven reserves in the Stabroek block, which means as that contract comes to an end, it expires, we will now have the opportunity to apply, when they come for a new one, to apply the new production chain agreement with the new fiscal terms. So you can't run this business like a cake shop, and these things have ramification. Let me come back to, we have a few more minutes. Let me see another, if there's any other question I want to share with you that stood out to me. There is one particular question, there's a lot of them, but let me end with this one. There is one particular question where he asked, what is our he gave the example of a question posed to the president and how the president respond. This is Glenn Lal I'm talking about. And he wanted to solicit the professor's comment on that. It's too much to go into read here because I have limited time. But you could go and you will listen to it. And when you listen to it, you'll understand. What did you think the professor did? the professor actually defended the president. The professor defended the president because he understands the reality and the practicalities of running a country and dealing with multinationals. When you're negotiating deals, and you've heard the president said this several times, and even the vice president, that it is not easy to negotiate with Exxon. These are powerful multinationals. The simple rule in negotiating, it's about balance of power and what you can leverage. Now, the fact that we have 11 billion barrels of proven reserve, that is not the only thing, and that is not sufficient for us to leverage. We don't have enough power that we can leverage as yet against ExxonMobil or these multinationals. And the professor went on to explain the intricacies of these sort of challenges and how governments navigate them. And based on where we are today, based on the policy stance, based on what the government has achieved in relation to an improved net take for the country, local content, gas to shore, improve terms of the license, and so many other things for the country, the government, you have to you will conclude that the government is doing the right thing, because in fairness to the professor, the publisher only presented his opinion. He didn't give you the full context, which you would know the full context of Guyana, and you will make your own judgment. So, with that said, let me see if I could view, if there are any questions I could probably deal with before I close tonight's show. Okay, someone saying to play the video, but it was too much to play the video. Alright, I haven't seen much questions here, so with that, I'll close for tonight. Thank you for joining me tonight and listening. Have a good night.